Hello everyone, I'm really excited today to show you the work we have been doing on Formwerk. Formwerk is a library that we have been working on since December 2023, so it's been a year, a month or so working on it, and basically it's a new kind of form library or a new way to write your forms in Vue.js. So for those who don't know me, I already built a library called Validate, which is the most popular form library for Vue.js at the moment. But Formwerk is a different take on that. It's something that I would consider what I want Validate to evolve to be eventually. So today it's the very first look at it, and I hope you find it interesting. So what is Formwerk or Formwerk? Doesn't matter how you want to pronounce it, whatever is easier. So Formwerk is form library, right? But it sits at a different abstraction layer than other form libraries. And to understand that better, I built this like spectrum kind of thing. So on one end of the spectrum, you have low abstraction level libraries like Validate, which is very flexible. It gives you a lot of flexibility because they only care about validating data and they have very minor ways to interface them with your components or your state. So it's very flexible. You can do a lot of things with it, but it lacks a lot of features because at such a low abstraction layer, it cannot do much for you. So let's go higher a little bit in the abstraction layer. And I'm not, by saying higher or lower, doesn't mean anything is better or worse. It's a different abstraction, so it's a different trade-offs. With Validate, it sits at a higher abstraction level. So it needs a little bit of information about your UI. It needs to know a little bit what's going on there in order for it to help you. So it can do form submission, it can do validation for you, it can do some stuff like a touch state, submitting state, stuff like that. However, at the lower end, or at the very high abstraction layer, you have some stuff like FormKit or other UI libraries, where they sit on a way that they give you a lot. At that abstraction level, they can give you accessibility. They can give you pretty much anything you need, right, in terms of forms. But what Formwerk tries to do is there is a gap between the two. So the gap here is trying to address the trade-offs that both ends don't really quite do well. For example, Validate doesn't do accessibility for you because it doesn't know enough about your UI that it can do that. At the same time, UI libraries are a little harder to override because you always fight a losing battle with markup or with CSS. So overriding, at some point you cannot override, and at some point you'll have to build from scratch. Maybe that point never comes for you. Sometimes it does. For me, it always kind of happens in the life cycle of projects. So Formwerk sits in the middle here. So what are the key promises here from Formwerk? So first, it is customizable, but because it is customizable in a different way. It has no markup, it has no UI, it has no CSS, right? It has no styling whatsoever. So it's your styles, it's your markup. We only provide JavaScript. So that's the abstraction level that we are sitting at. And that gives you a lot of flexibility because that means you can build your website, your brand in the way that you think it should be, right? There is nothing to override. There is no losing battle with styling. Formwerk also is accessible because it implements all the ARIA guidelines and recommended patterns published in their website for all kinds of inputs. So they have really amazing guides and really strict rules on how each input should behave and what attributes should be where on which elements. And Formwerk does that really well through its kind of weird API that you will take a look at in a second. Formwerk also does interactions for you. So many of these inputs have keyboard shortcuts. Many of them have focus management, like selects and combo boxes. There is a lot of behavior going on with interactions that your users expect. There is nothing more frustrating than opening up a select element that doesn't support searching, and it has hundreds of like entries that are not alphabetically sorted. So that's a nightmare for me. Like whenever I see this, that's really horrible. So Formwerk tries as much as possible to give you what your users expect out of these inputs to make their experience very nice. Another thing is internationalization or I10N. And here, when usual people hear this, word ITN, they figure out it's about translating messages. For Formwerk, it doesn't. You already have Vue ITN or Next ITN, and they are really good at this. So we aren't trying to solve a solved problem. But what we will focus on are the behaviors around the ITN issues. For example, right to left. Right to left is usually for Arabic language, Hebrew maybe. For the right to left languages have a lot of weirdness going on with them. If you ever built one website, it will feel flipped to you. So what you think should be on the left is on the right, and it's really confusing. But interaction is also confusing there. For example, arrow keys. Let's say you are dealing with a slider and you want to increase the value. Do you go left or do you go right? Right? So Formwerk does that for you. And at the same time, you have numbers and dates, which you will take a look at in a second. Lastly, form developer experience. So everything you expected from vValidate or other libraries, like form trees, state tracking, validation, organization through form groups or repeaters or submission handling, scrolling to the first invalid input, all these kinds of stuff, Formwerk will do for you. So who is Formwerk for? Who is the ideal user for this library? So we realize it's not gonna fit for everyone's use case, but for people like me who build stuff from scratch, this is a really ideal library for this because it gives you just enough that you only need to write your CSS and your styling, and that's what we mostly change over time. We don't change behaviors a lot, but we change UI a lot. So that's what it tries to do. Another kinds of user are developers who already have an already implemented design system that they implemented themselves, and they want to adopt Formwerk into their existing design system for delegation, like delegate all this complicated form stuff to Formwerk so they don't have to worry about it anymore, so they can focus on their UI and their UX in general. Another kind of users are UI library authors. So as a UI library author, of course, you might have forms, and if you do, then just delegate the work to Formwerk. Add it as a dependency, and just focus on your UI, your experience, your everything around having a great UI, because there is nothing worse than having a really good UI library that is a little bit lacking in forms. So what Formwerk does, it gives you a really good baseline to build your forms on top of. So any kinds of user can really benefit from. So let's talk about styling and UI. How does it work? So first, Formwerk has a bunch of fields like this text field, slider, select field, checkboxes, and so on. Each one of these fields has an anatomy, and the anatomy basically means it has a few key elements. Composables that you will import and use from Formwerk expose prop objects for these key elements. And what you will do is you will bind these props to your elements in your markup, and then just add your own styles. This may sound complicated, but here's how it looks. This is an anatomy of a compo box component. When you look at it, yeah, that's a compo box. It has like an input, it has a label, it has maybe a description or a message, it has a trigger button, and this is what Formwerk does. It gives you props for each kind of these things that you see on your UI. And the documentation, you don't have to guess the anatomy for each component. Formwerk already tells you, here, this is the anatomy that we support, and this is how you should build it. So the documentation is really thorough on that. So here is an example. We have a simple text box, and I will draw a little bit here. So really love Slido.dev. So what we have here is we have props like input props and label props, and we have not this one, and we have error message props. And what we will do is just bind it on the anatomy elements or the key elements. So we have a label here, we have an input here, and we have the error message props here. This is what you need to do on almost every single input. That's it. That's all that's required. And once you do all of that, you get a fully functional input. So it validates, and yeah, that's pretty much it. Let's take it up a little notch. So if you see the code here, this is all just normal CSS. This is my own code. This is not some framework. Literally, this is just the JavaScript I need, this part right here. So let's talk about something else, like with Tailwind. I can use Tailwind to style my own fields. For example, here we have a slider, and it's exactly the same principle. So I have a bunch of prop objects like group props, track props, label props, and so on. All I need to do is bind them to the right elements. So let me remove that, scroll down here, and then draw again. So we have, the group props here, the label props here, the track props here, and the error message props here. And we have a couple of thumbs. These are like small components that you will have to implement that also Formwerk does it for you. Like Formwerk gives you a composable called use slider thumb, and you can use it to build a component. But with that, with just this amount of JavaScript, we built a fully functional slider. And what you will get for free is a fully functional slider. So like it doesn't go, like one value doesn't go over the other. So it handles that. It handles touch. It handles arrow keys. It handles page up, page down, stuff like that. And it's aware of its limits. It knows the slider maximum is 1000, and it knows the next thumb is in the way, so it won't go over it. So you get that for free with just amount of JavaScript. Whatever I have else here is just styling. So let's talk about accessibility. So accessibility is a little tricky because doing no accessibility is better than doing wrong accessibility, right? Which makes it a little hard, and you can never be perfect. So what we will do is we follow closely the ARIA guidelines and patterns that are published on their website, and we auto-associate inputs and labels in a really interesting way. And we are also aware of your DOM elements using like a ref capture system that we have that morphs the attributes to suit however you are building your UI, right? Like you can build a checkbox with an input type checkbox or without it, right? You can make it visually hidden, or you can have a bunch of divs and call it a checkbox, right? So Formwerk adapts to both these use cases. And here is a small example on how it works. So we have a label and an input combo. That's pretty typical, right? It's the for attribute points to the ID of the element. However, Formwerk detects if you are not using a label element, then it will morph the attributes of the input to be like ARIA labeled by, because it's not associated anymore with the label element. However, if you go one step further and maybe not use a label element at all, and Formwerk can tell that because it can tell, hey, you didn't bind the label props to anything. So this input has no label, so I'll just slap the label on it using ARIA label. And this way it maintains accessibility, even though you are trying your hardest to build an inaccessible UI. So let's move on to something like interactions. So like I said, Formwerk gives you high quality interactions only in JavaScript. It doesn't care really about CSS, and it has a comprehensive keyboard support for each kind of field. So selects, combo boxes, and all the sorts. It also has focus management for these inputs that need it, like radio buttons and for checkboxes, and it follows the ARIA guidelines on how that should happen. And there is a lot of intricacies there. For example, radios, you cannot tab through each individual radio, but you can arrow key through them. So Formwerk handles that. Touch support is still in progress. Right now, there are no major bugs in it, but we are on the lookout. If you can find anything, that would be great. So here is a quick demo. I have a select element, and I have a bunch of interactions that I want to test. So first, I want to open the pop-up with space. So that works. I want to move with arrow keys, and that's focus trapping. And I want to select maybe Brazil, and then I want to find my home country, Egypt, by typing E, like you would do in a normal select, and it does that for you. It's not quite searchable. That's the combo box. So you should use that if you want a full search. We can also focus the very last option or the very first option with page up and page down, and that also works. And there is even a lot more interactions that I didn't cover, especially if the input, if the select itself is multiple. So you have shift arrow down does something, you have shift control does something else, and all of that is documented on the documentation, so check it out. And this is all the code you need to do all of what I just showed you, this bunch of script. Of course, there are a little more intricacies, like you have to build an option component and you have to build an option group component if you need option groups. But for the most part, that's all the JavaScript you need, which is like, if we omit the props, it's one function call, and my print width would just do this. Like it's literally one line. Now let's talk about I10N, which is something I'm really proud of here. So internationalization in Formwerk, we care about locale and direction. So we auto-detect the website's locale, not the user's locale, right? Because it's different. So, or you can configure your own using Vue I10N, it doesn't really matter. And we handle RTL support by swapping the horizontal arrow keys if it makes sense. And if there is an orientation considerations, we always do that. We also do that. There is also numbers, because not everyone uses the same number system, right? We all use the Latin numbers that we all see everywhere, right? But there are different numerals, different shapes, and even the native input type number doesn't support them. So we kind of fix that as well. And it supports some basic formatting. Date fields, same thing, but not everyone uses the same calendar. We have multiple calendars all over the world. Humans are very smart beings, and they came up with different calendar systems, and we support most of them. So, and you can, of course, integrate Vue on Next.js. So let me show you the numbering system. Demo. So we have here is number field, right? You can arrow key through it. You can plus and minus these buttons. You can type in it. It's a number input, right? Nothing really too fancy. But let me change a few things. First, let's add like a unit. I think that's here. So yeah, kilometers. Let's go with kilobyte. And it supports that. So if I type, yeah. So it auto formats for you, and it does that really well. Now let's change a few things. First, let's switch the numbering system to be Arabic. So these are Arabic number. I can vouch for it being correct, but let's change the language as well. And then that's the word kilobyte. And yeah, I can vouch for that being correct as well. But if you want to be extra interesting, that's Chinese numbers, and it also works. And the most beautiful thing about this is the user can type whatever they want, right? And it will give you the actual JavaScript number. So you don't have to worry about parsing it or do anything about this. Another thing is micro interactions around this. So I switch back to English. And if the user, for whatever reason, uses Arabic numbers, so let me switch. So yeah, it respects the user choice of using these number system, because it's a number. It shouldn't really care about it. However, you can lock it if you say, I'm only interested in Latin numbers. So you have a lot of flexibility here. Now, this is all the code you need to get all of this for free. So that's pretty much it. Now let's take a look at calendars, which is even more complicated, and it's still a work in progress. It's still in a PR. We aren't really finished with it. So I'll start with the normal calendar that we all use, the Gregor calendar, and yeah, all of the features that you see here, like being able to manipulate the individual segments with arrow keys or just typing in them, it just works. And if I choose to, and it knows when it should move on to the next segment, and yeah, it's fully functional date field, and it gives you a way to be able to generate these calendar days and days of the week, which day, like the start of the week, the weekends, and so on. So it gives you all that information, or it should give you that information. It's still a work in progress, but let me make things interesting. So I will switch to the, let me go back to English, switch to long format. So you can still toggle through these. So I can switch the days and the month here, but let me switch to Arabic, and that's a day, right? And this is a month. I can vouch for them being correct. I don't remember which days I picked, but if I switch to the Islamic calendar, and then it says Zul Hijjah, and that's a month that we have. And if you go back to English, that's it in English. So you get all of that for free. And if you are building, you probably will not build a website if you are in the West for these kinds of countries that use these calendars. But for us, it's like every 2 websites, you have to build it almost. So this is all the code you need to get all of this. So that's it, pretty much. 2 function calls, and that's it. Let's move quickly through Form.js because I think I'm going out of time. So form state, you get tracking submission, you get nested fields through groups and repeaters, you get control the uncontrolled fields, You get multi-layered validation, you get aggregated state, you get type safety through submission or through the current values, just like vValidate, and it auto scrolls to first invalid field, and you can consume your submitted data in any shape or form you need, like maybe a plain object if you plan to do some processing on it, JSON if you want to just send it to a JSON endpoint, or form data if you are uploading files or doing something like that. And we are working on a Vue DevTools as well to make debugging easier for you. So let me skip through the examples. Control fields. So control fields are fields that propagate their validation state and they get submitted. So as long as a field has a name property, then it's controlled. It will submit its value, it will be validated as well. If it is uncontrolled, then you just, if you want to make it uncontrolled, then just remove the name prop, which is exactly like native HTML. So it won't be validated as part of the form, but it can validate itself, and it won't submit its value. So it's very good for having, maybe you have a switch that kind of enables or toggles two more inputs or disables them. You don't want to submit the switch value, right? So that's an uncontrolled field. Now, for schema validation, we are supporting HTML validation, but we also are a very early adopter of the standard schema, which have been making wave for a while now. So that means we support Zod, Valibot, and Archetype, and I think 3 more have joined the party. And here is a quick example. You just pass the schema in, you get the types, you get validation for you, and yeah, that's pretty much it. This is with Zod, this is with Valibot, and this is with Archetype. And all you have to, there's no resolvers needed. There are no more packages you need to install. Just pass your schema in and you're good to go. Now, the DevTools is still a work in progress. So basically you have a form and it will show you the form tree. It should be prettier than that, but it's still a work in progress. So it's similar to what we have in vValidate already, but we plan to have a lot more features there, like events and so on. For the roadmap, we plan to have date fields by the end of February, so very close. DevTools, same timeline. File fields, also same timeline. OTP fields next month on March. Multi-step forms also in March. Starter kits around April, and we hope to reach V1 by April as well. And we will appreciate any of your ideas and suggestions for any kind of fields that you think are missing or we should work on. I want to thank a couple of impactful contributors here. We have Amr Mohammed, who helped us who is working on the Vue DevTools and who shipped a lot of improvements to the form state. Also Eugene, who worked on, and I hope I said the name right, who worked on making form groups nested, and you can nest them as much as you want to, and yeah, fixing state around that as well. If you need anything to learn more about the project, just go to formwerk.dev. I'll be happy to answer any question related to that, or just create an issue, join the community, join our Discord. We are very open to any kind of contributions or feedback. So that's all for me today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I will be sharing it shortly. Thank you.
Thank you. We do have a few questions for you. It looks like the first one, can you compare Formwerk's headless model to FormKit's design?
Okay, so I didn't use FormKit extensively, but always there is a problem with UI libraries, which is the point where their customization doesn't work anymore. For example, you don't have the slot to change something. You don't have a way to hook into that HTML that needs rendering, because that's always a problem. Maybe you can override all the CSS if you want to, but you can't override the HTML as well, so unless they give you slots. And if you give you a slot for everything, then it's kind of weird. Also, there are a lot of categories around headless UI libraries. Like there is headless UI libraries, and then there is unstyled UI libraries, and then there is whatever Formwerk is, like it's no UI library, right? So they all kind of are fitted into the same category, which is unfortunate, but they are different abstraction layers. So Formwerk, at least, you don't have to worry about HTML or CSS, because we think HTML and CSS are closely tied, right? Like you have so many limited ways you can override something if you don't have access to the HTML, right? So let's just not do UI at all and give you all the power you need to do that, because that's the part that always needs changing. UI, not the behaviors. A text box is always a text box, right? Select element is always a select element. More or less, of course, I'm generalizing here, but that's the beauty of it.
Thank you. And last question, how does Formwork handle async validation?
Formwerk is asynchronous by default, so all validation is asynchronous, and that's part of the design of standard schemas as well. They support, I think, at the moment only sync validation, so there is no way to do sync validation really. And it handles it by patching job, like we have a scheduler system, mini scheduler system that will patch. Like if 5 fields require validation all at the same time, then it will only fire one async schema validation call. So it's efficient in that regard, and it will assign the errors for you. So that works if you are talking about async validation, that you are validating something on the server. You can set your errors manually. So it's I think it's doing it pretty well, unless I missed I missed the question or didn't
No,
understand it.
I think that was great. Thank you so much for joining us today. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.